She was a woman marked by 2 deaths, her husband's, and her own wombs. The Canyonlands did not care which had condemned her, only that she was alone and would soon be theirs. Gila Wilderness, Arizona Territory. Autumn, 1878. The wind was a blade, honing itself on the edges of sandstone cliffs and skeletal mesquite. It peeled the last clinging warmth from the air, promising a winter of hard, white truths. For the wagon train, it was a spur, urging them toward the distant promise of greener valleys. For Elara, it was a shroud. She stood where they had left her, a solitary, black-clad figure against the immense, indifferent palette of ochre and rust. Her worldly possessions amounted to a near-empty burlap sack and the threadbare shawl clutched around her shoulders. It was the last thing her husband, Jacob, had given her. Now, it felt like a cage of memories. The leader of the train, her brother-in-law Silas Blackwood, had made the proclamation with a chilling righteousness. His voice, thin and cruel, still echoed in the hollows of her mind. A barren womb is a curse from God. We'll carry no such ill fortune with us. We'll not waste food on fallow ground. The others, men and women she had baked bread for and mended clothes for, had simply turned their faces away. Their silence was its own sharp stone, cast with precision. Shame was a heavier burden than her sack. It bent her spine, pulled her gaze to the dusty earth. She had watched the wagon shrink into smudges of canvas and dust until they were swallowed by the horizon, taking with them the only world she knew. She had not cried. Tears were a moisture she could not afford to lose. For a day, she walked. She followed no path, for all paths led away from her. She was simply putting one foot in front of the other, a mechanical act of defiance against the inevitable. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer, and the wind stole her breath. By the second day, the world had begun to tilt and shimmer. The red rocks bled into the blue sky. She stumbled, her knees striking the unforgiving ground. The burlap sack fell from her grasp, spilling its pathetic contents, a tin cup, a small, hard biscuit, and a worn Bible. She lay there, her cheek pressed against the grit and stone, the scent of dust and dry sage filling her nostrils. This, then, was the end of the story. A footnote in a family Bible, if anyone bothered to write it. Elara, wife of Jacob, died in the wilderness. They would not write why. They would not write of the curse, of the shame, of being left behind. She closed her eyes. The world went dark. But it was not the darkness of death. It was the cool, deep shade of a man's shadow falling over her. She did not have the strength to open her eyes, but she sensed him. The soft scuff of moccasins on stone, not the hard stamp of a settler's boot. A presence, still and silent as the monoliths that guarded the canyon. She felt hands, strong and surprisingly gentle, slide beneath her back and knees. They were not the grasping, bruising hands of Silas. They lifted her as if she weighed no more than a child's doll. Her head lolled against a chest as solid as sun-warmed rock, the smell of pine smoke, leather, and the wild earth itself filling her senses. She surrendered to the darkness then, carried away from the place of her abandonment by a silent, unknown force. He was a man carved from the canyons themselves, his face a roadmap of sorrows she could not yet read. Cale had seen the wagon train pass 2 days prior, a scar of dust and noise upon the quiet land. He had watched them from the high ridges, his presence no more than a hawk's shadow. He had seen her, too, the small figure left behind. He had waited. The wilderness was a swift and efficient judge. It sorted the living from the dead with dispassionate speed. He expected to find only bones, a feast for the coyotes. Instead, he found a flicker of life, a stubborn ember refusing to be extinguished. He saw not a white woman, an enemy, an intruder. He saw a human being, discarded by her own kind. His own family had been taken by the blue-coat soldiers, their laughter and light erased from the world in a morning of gunfire and smoke. The scar that ran from his temple to his jaw was a permanent reminder of that day. He knew what it was to be left with nothing but ghosts. He carried her toward his home, a place hidden from the world, nestled in a protective crook of the mountains. It was not pity that moved him. It was a deeper, quieter recognition. In the fragile weight of her body, he felt the echo of his own solitude. Elara awoke to the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. She was lying on a pallet of soft furs, a rough-spun blanket covering her. Her eyes fluttered open, taking in the scene with a surge of panicked adrenaline. She was in a dwelling that was part cave, part cabin, the walls a seamless blend of natural rock and carefully fitted timber. Firelight danced across the stone, making the shadows writhe and retreat. A small fire pit in the center of the room was the source of the warmth and the smell. Her thin shawl had been folded neatly and placed beside her, next to her tin cup, which was now filled with water. She pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. And then she saw him. He sat on the other side of the fire, his back to her, tending to a piece of venison roasting on a spit. He was broad-shouldered, with long, dark hair tied back with a leather cord. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, no motion wasted. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. This was an Apache, a ghost from the settlers' terrifying stories. A savage. A killer. She held her breath, expecting him to turn, to reveal a cruel face, to enact the horrors she had been taught to expect. He did not turn. He simply continued his task, as if he were entirely alone. Hours seemed to pass. The sun shifted, and a beam of light cut through a high opening in the rock, illuminating a cloud of dust motes in a golden shaft. He took the cooked meat from the fire, sliced off a piece with a sharp knife, and placed it on a flat stone. He slid the stone, along with her cup of water, across the earthen floor until it was within her reach. Then he rose and walked out of the dwelling, disappearing into the blinding daylight without a single word or a backward glance. She stared at the food. Her stomach cramped with a hunger so profound it was painful. But her fear was greater. Was it poisoned? Was this a trick? She waited, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. But the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant cry of an eagle. Finally, the gnawing emptiness in her belly won. She ate. The meat was rich and smoky, the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank the water, and it was like pouring life back into her veins. This became their rhythm. He would hunt, he would provide. He would leave food and water for her and then make himself absent, granting her the privacy of a queen in his humble home. He never spoke. He never looked at her directly for more than a fleeting moment. His presence was a silent, steady fact, like the mountain outside. She began to heal. The gaunt hollows of her cheeks filled out. The strength returned to her limbs. She started to observe the details of his life. The neatly arranged tools for tanning hides, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, the precise way he banked the fire at night. There was no chaos here, only order and purpose. One evening, while he was gone, she saw him mending her boots by the fading light. The soles had been worn through, and she had expected to be barefoot for the rest of her short life. He was stitching a new layer of thick, supple leather onto them with a bone-awl and sinew thread. His large, scarred hands worked with an impossible delicacy. The next morning, the boots were beside her pallet, stronger than they had ever been. She put them on, and the fit was perfect. A strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. It was not gratitude, not yet. It was a more fragile thing. A seedling of trust, pushing its way through the compacted soil of her fear. She knew she had to do something. She could not simply be a vessel, taking and taking. One afternoon, she took the broth he had left for her. It was thin but nourishing. Rummaging through his collection of dried plants, she found some wild onions and a familiar-looking herb. She crushed them and added them to the pot, then set it back over the heat. The aroma changed, becoming richer, more complex. When he returned at dusk, he picked up the bowl and paused. He lifted it to his nose, inhaling deeply. He looked across the fire at her, a long, searching look. She held his gaze for a heartbeat before dropping her eyes to her lap. He said nothing. But when he ate the broth, there was a new quality to the silence. It was no longer a void between them. It had become a space they shared. A few days later, he brought in a freshly killed rabbit. He skinned it with practiced ease and began to prepare it. He glanced at her. "Eat," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, but it was not unkind. It was the first word he had spoken to her. She found her own voice, a dry, rusty thing. "Thank you," she whispered. The trust, once a seedling, had begun to sprout leaves. She started to help, performing small tasks. She swept the floor with a branch of sage, she kept the water skins full, she learned to grind corn on a flat stone. They worked in a comfortable quiet, a man and a woman building a life out of the remnants of two broken ones. The winter came on fast and hard, a white wolf descending from the peaks. Snow fell in a thick, silent blanket, burying the landscape and sealing them in their sanctuary. The world outside shrank to the swirling vortex of white visible through the doorway. Inside, the fire became the center of their universe, a constant, living thing that held the deadly cold at bay. The forced proximity changed the texture of their silence. It was deeper, more intimate. They were two heartbeats in the vast, frozen emptiness. For Ilara, the relentless howling of the wind began to claw at old wounds. It sounded like voices, whispering accusations in the dark. Barren. Useless. Cursed. One night, the storm reached its zenith. The wind shrieked like a wounded beast, rattling the timbers of the small cabin. Ilara was pulled under by a dream, dragged back to the moment of her exile. She saw Silas's face, contorted with scorn. She saw the other women, their eyes cold and pitiless, pulling their children closer as if she were a plague. Fallow ground, the wind howled, and it was Silas's voice. She awoke with a strangled gasp, sitting bolt upright. Her body was slick with a cold sweat, her breath coming in ragged sobs. He was there. Cale had not been sleeping. He sat on his own pallet across the fire, his back against the stone wall, a silent guardian. In the flickering firelight, the old scar on his face seemed to stand out in sharp relief. He did not move, did not speak. He simply watched her, his presence a steady anchor in the turmoil of her fear. His stillness gave her a strange permission. The dam of her silence, built over years of shame and quiet suffering, finally broke. The words came out in a torrent, quiet and broken at first, then gaining a desperate strength. "He was my husband's brother," she began, her voice trembling. "Silas. After Jacob died, the fever took him so fast. Silas said I was a burden. A curse." She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "He said God had judged me. Because I could not give Jacob a son. He told everyone I was barren." An empty vessel. She looked up, her eyes pleading with him to understand the depth of this particular shame in her world. To them, a woman who cannot bear children is less than worthless. She is a blight. He took our wagon, our ox, everything. He said it was his right. And he left me there to die. She finished, her story hanging in the air between them, fragile and raw. The only sound was the crackling fire and the dying wind. He listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. He absorbed her pain, letting it settle in the quiet space of his own history. When she was finally spent, hollowed out by her confession, he moved. He reached for a small object on a ledge behind him and held it out. It was a small wooden horse, worn smooth by the touch of small hands. It was crudely carved but full of life. "My son," Cale said, his voice softer now. He was 4 winters old. He gestured to the scar on his face. "Blue coats. They came at dawn." For the land, his gaze flickered toward a spot in the darkest corner of the cave. "My wife, she fought for him. They took them both from me." He did not need to say more. His grief was a vast, silent canyon that mirrored her own. In that moment, she understood. He did not see her as a white woman, and she no longer saw him as a fearsome Apache. They were simply two people, survivors of different massacres, marked by the same brand of loss. He saw her not as barren, but as a woman who had been robbed of her family, just as he had. He had been left alone, she had been cast out. The source was different, but the wound was the same. She reached out a trembling hand and her fingers brushed against the smooth wood of the toy horse. A single tear, the first she had shed since her husband's death, traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of understanding. A shared desolation had forged a bond far stronger than any spoken promise. The storm outside had passed. The world was hushed, clean, and white. And inside their small shelter, a new, fragile peace had been born. Spring thawed the world with a gentle hand. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, and the canyon floor erupted in a riot of improbable green and vibrant wildflowers. A sense of new beginning infused the air. Elara and Cale had settled into a life that was more than just survival. It was a partnership. He taught her the language of the wilderness, which roots were medicine, which berries were poison, how to read the clouds for signs of rain. She, in turn, brought a sense of domestic order to his solitary existence. She learned to tan hides until they were supple, to weave baskets from river reeds, and her cooking transformed their simple meals into something that tasted of home. The silence between them was now a rich and comfortable language. A shared look could convey a question, a gesture an answer. One afternoon, as Cale was teaching her to fletch an arrow, their hands brushed. A current passed between them, sudden and startling. He paused, his dark eyes searching hers. The air grew thick with unspoken things. But the moment was shattered by a sound that did not belong. The nicker of a horse, too close. And then, a man's voice, coarse and familiar. "Well, I'll be damned." Look what the savage dragged in as Silas Blackwood stood at the edge of the clearing, flanked by 2 other men from the wagon train. They looked gaunt and hard-bitten, their clothes in tatters. The promise of greener valleys had clearly soured. Silas's eyes fixed on Elara, a venomous mixture of shock and fury in his gaze. He took in her healthy appearance, the sturdy buckskin dress Cale had made for her, the life in her eyes. To him, her survival was a personal affront, a defiance of his judgment. "The cursed woman," he sneered, spitting on the ground. Still breathing. "I should have finished you myself." Cale rose slowly, placing himself between Elara and the intruders. He was utterly calm, a mountain preparing to weather a storm. He said nothing. His stillness was more menacing than any threat. "Get out of the way, Apache," one of the other men snarled, raising his rifle. "She's coming with us." The confrontation exploded with the brutal speed of a lightning strike. Cale moved not like a man, but like a force of nature. Before the rifle was even level, he had closed the distance, a blur of motion. He disarmed the man with a sharp blow to the wrist, sending the weapon flying. The second man charged with a knife, but Cale sidestepped, using the man's own momentum to send him crashing into a rock outcropping. It was over in seconds. The 2 men were groaning on the ground, incapacitated. But Silas was different. He was fueled by a deeper malice. He lunged not for Cale, but for Elara, grabbing her by the arm. He dragged her in front of him, pressing the cold steel of a hunting knife to her throat. "I told you," he hissed in her ear, his breath foul. "You are nothing. Nothing without a man to own you, and you were too worthless to even bear a child. You belong to me by law." In that instant, something broke inside Elara. It was not her spirit, but her fear. All the shame, all the silent suffering, coalesced into a single point of cold, hard fury. She was not the woman he had cast out. She was not fallow ground. She was a survivor. She was home. With a guttural cry, she drove her elbow back into Silas's ribs. As he grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second, she acted. Her hand darted to the small skinning knife tucked into her belt, the one Cale had given her. It felt like an extension of her own will. She didn't stab to kill. She stabbed to live. She plunged the small blade into the fleshy part of Silas's thigh. He screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, and his knife arm dropped. That was all the opening Cale needed. He was on Silas in an instant, a silent, avenging shadow. He struck once, a single, precise blow to the side of Silas's head. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The threat was over. Silence descended once more, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded men and the heavy breathing of Ilara. She stood, her chest heaving, the small, blooded knife still clutched in her hand. Cale turned to her, his eyes taking in the fire of defiance that had replaced her fear. He looked at the knife in her hand, then back to her face. He saw not a victim, but a warrior. The aftermath of the violence was as quiet as the canyon itself. Cale bound the two conscious men and left them with their unconscious leader, a day's walk from their horses with a single skin of water. Their fate would be decided by the wilderness they had failed to tame. He would not bring the stain of their execution into the home he had built. When he returned, Ilara was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. She had washed the blood from the small knife and set it aside. The adrenaline had faded, leaving her trembling. He came and sat beside her, not speaking, just sharing the space, letting his calm presence soothe the tremors. The sun began to dip below the cliffs, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Cale reached over and gently took her hand. His touch was warm and steady. Then he rose and walked to the small ledge where her few possessions were kept. He picked up the tattered old shawl, the one her husband had given her, the symbol of her old life and her public shame. He held it for a moment, then turned and tossed it into the heart of the fire. The drywall caught instantly, flaring up in a bright, almost defiant burst of light before turning to ash. Ilara watched it burn, feeling a profound sense of release, as if years of sorrow were being incinerated with it. Cale then retrieved something else. It was a blanket he had been weaving in secret over the long winter months. It was made of the softest rabbit fur and strong, dyed yucca fiber, woven into a pattern of mountains and stars. It was a thing of beauty and warmth, of profound effort and care. He knelt before her and draped it over her shoulders. It settled around her with a comforting weight. "You are not a curse," he said, his voice low and certain. "You are life." He looked into her eyes, and she saw in them a future she had never dared to imagine. "Be my wife, Ilara. This is your home." The words were a simple statement of fact, not a question demanding an answer. He was not claiming her. He was recognizing her. She raised a hand to the soft fur of the new blanket, then met his gaze. Her own voice was clear and steady when she spoke, with no trace of the whisper it had once been. "This is my home," she said. It was a vow. A treaty. The beginning of everything. In the weeks that followed, a new and deeper peace settled over them. They were no longer two solitary people sharing a space, but a single unit, their lives intertwined like the fibers of the blanket he had made her. And then, the miracle. It began as a whisper in her own body, a feeling she had long since dismissed as a cruel trick of hope. A flutter. A change. She, Ilara, the barren woman, the fallow ground, was pregnant. She told him not with words, but with a look. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she took his hand and placed it gently on her belly. He stilled, his eyes widening in stunned comprehension. He looked from her belly to her face, and a slow, rare smile spread across his features, softening the harsh lines of his scar. In his eyes, she saw not just joy, but a kind of reverence. It was a quiet, sacred moment, a secret shared only with the whispering wind and the ancient, watching stars. A new life, conceived not in duty or shame, but in a healing sanctuary of love and acceptance. 5 years later, the light of the setting sun cast long, peaceful shadows across the canyon. The small dwelling of rock and timber had grown. There was a small, fenced garden now, bursting with corn, squash, and beans. A sturdy corral held 2 placid horses. It was a homestead carved not from conquest, but from harmony with the land. A small boy with his father's dark, knowing eyes and his mother's determined chin ran laughing through the clearing, chasing a butterfly. He clutched the old, worn wooden horse in one hand, and a new, smaller one, a filly carved to match, in the other. His laughter was the only sound that mattered, an echo of life reclaimed. Ilara watched him from the doorway, her hands covered in flour. The haunted, hunted look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, abiding calm. She moved with the quiet purpose of a woman who knows exactly where she belongs. Cale sat on a bench he had built, mending a bridle. He watched his son, then looked at his wife. The deep lines of sorrow on his face had not vanished, but they had been softened by years of quiet contentment. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a husband, a father. A man who had found his tribe in the two people who shared his world. They had not sought to build an empire or a legacy of land and gold. They had built something far more precious. They had built a sanctuary. They had created a family from the ashes of two broken worlds, a testament to the idea that home is not a place you find, but a place you make, and that love can bloom in the most unforgiving of landscapes. Their story was never written in any book or recorded in any town ledger. It became a quiet legend, whispered on the wind through the canyons, a story of a woman left to die who found life, and a man who had lost everything who found it all again. Their story is a powerful reminder that our worth is never determined by the harsh judgments of others or the limitations they try to place upon us. It shows us that the places in our lives we have been told are barren and cursed can, with love and acceptance, become the very ground where new life, new hope, and new strength can grow. True family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we build through mutual respect, shared healing, and unwavering protection. It is a testament to the quiet, unbreakable resilience of the human heart and its incredible capacity to create a sanctuary even in the harshest wilderness. If their journey from desolation to hope touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit. Share this message of resilience with someone who might need to hear it.